Jared Diamond is a professor of geography at UCLA. He's been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. Among his many awards are the Japan's Cosmo Prize, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, those are the ones they call the Genius Grants, and the Lewis Thomas Prize honoring the scientist as poet. I like that one. His books include Collapse, The World Until Yesterday, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Guns, Germs, and Steel, and his latest, Upheaval, Turning Points for Nations in Crisis. Jared, I like people to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas. And I noticed that I often start by asking people about their path, but your path is quite circuitous. But I notice on your website you have a section you title, How I Came to My Mix of Interests. So briefly, how did you?
By a circuitous path. My father was a physician, my mother was a linguist and concert pianist, and so I was interested both in the humanities and writing and science. I was initially pre-med, and in the last semester of my college career, I decided I wanted to do science rather than medicine, and so I got a PhD in physiology. I was one of the world's expert on the gallbladder.
Right.
For several decades, I taught medical students at UCLA, but I had become a bird watcher at age 7, so I began a second career on New Guinea birds when I was 28 years old, and I've kept that up. And then finally, as my interest shifted to history and geography, in 2002, I closed my physiology lab and moved from UCLA's medical school to the college. So I'm now a professor of geography, and I teach geography to undergraduates, and that's the path.
Okay, and one thing, I asked him backstage if he's going back to New Guinea, and the answer is?
Every year and a half, and that's what the matrimonial traffic will bear.
So, since 28, that's just fabulous. I interviewed you in 2005 on your book, Collapse, and I remember I particularly appreciated the subtitle, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, particularly the word choose. What were, just to sort of set a foundation in that realm, what were the key lessons of that book?
That book was mainly about societal collapses or avoiding collapses in the past. Before globalization, that meant that in the past, societies would collapse or survive one by one. When a society collapsed like Easter Island or the Maya, the repercussions did not travel around the world. Main influences on societal collapses in the past often were environmental influences. Today, in this globalized world, societies are interconnected. It's hard for societies to collapse one by one. Instead, the risk that we face today is of a worldwide collapse.
Right. Now, this book, for those who don't know, applies what works with individuals in crisis to will that work with nations in crisis? How do the two line up together? How did this book happen?
This book happened in two ways. One is that when I look back on the countries where I've lived for the last 60 years, the countries that I know best and where I speak the language, they've had crises. I was either living in them in the run-up to a crisis like Chile, or in the aftermath of a crisis like Indonesia, or during a slow crisis like Australia and Germany. That was one of the two pieces that went into the book. The other piece is that my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist. And in the first year of our marriage, Marie was doing a specialty in what's called crisis therapy, which is not the usual long-term therapy where you can work with someone for 3 years, but it's when someone comes in with an acute crisis, typically breakdown of a relationship, death of a loved one, a setback to health or to finances, and as you all know, you've all been through all of us have been through personal crises, and you know that you have to figure out something fast because you can't live in limbo forever. You have to figure out, what did I do wrong to get into this mess? What about myself needs changing, and what is okay? And as Marie talked with me about these outcome predictors for those of us in going through a personal crisis, I realized that some of them map closely onto outcome predictors for national crises, because nations as well as people get help from allies, not from individuals. Nations as well as people can look to other nations or people as models. But there are also differences, such as that nations have leaders and we individuals do not have leaders.
And so you begin to notice that it might work, you kind of track it, and then you jump into it deeply. And how quickly did you begin to go, this works, this is making sense, and you knew there was something there?
When I started the book, I knew that there was something there because Marie had done this specialty in 1982, and I began to write the book. No, I did not get triggered by the 2016 elections. I began to write the book when I finished my last book in 2013. And so I had 31 years to reflect on these things, and I knew that there was something there.
Okay. And one thing you say, and I think it's worth going into here, you say that this book is comparative, narrative, and exploratory. And I think it's interesting that you set that out as you begin. What do you mean by those?
Let's start off with comparative. Most history books are single case studies. You get books on late 17th century Germany, 18th century France. This book is not a single nation case study. Instead, it compares 7 of the countries that I know best. Comparisons offer disadvantages and advantages. In a book on Germany alone, you can devote all 400 pages to Germany. In a book on 7 countries, I get to devote only a few dozen pages to each country, so there's less detail. But from comparisons, you see questions and you can answer questions that would never occur to you if you looked at one country alone. And an example of that is the American Civil War. There are all these wonderful books on the American Civil War. And with a whole book on the Civil War, you can devote 6 pages to the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. But in a book on the American Civil War alone, you never notice one of the most interesting questions about the American Civil War, which is that in our Civil War, at the end, the victors did not kill the losers. There was only one person killed, the commandant of Andersonville prisoner of war camp, whereas in many civil wars, the Spanish Civil War and the Finnish Civil War, the victors did kill the losers in large numbers. So a comparative study of looking at different civil wars makes you realize there is a big question there, and what is the reason for that? That's what you can gain by comparison.
Very good, very good. And I know another thing you mentioned is you say that you had hoped originally to incorporate some modern quantitative methods to this, which is sort of an old dog trying new tricks there, right? That you hadn't done that before. And what happened to that hope?
It proved not feasible. It proved not feasible, first of all, because one has to begin by mapping out the terrain, by getting a sense of what are the variables and the main questions. This book maps out the terrain. In order to do a quantitative study, I would have to be able to put numbers on things such as help, success of making change, previous experience, but that requires working out social science methods, working out mathematical techniques, doing the statistics. You can't do that until you've mapped out the terrain. So that's something for the future.
Very good, very good. Okay, so what we've got is we have 7 nations, and you chose them, as you said, because they were the ones you knew best. I mean, people might quibble, but why not this one, why this one, and so on, but that was the reason. And then you choose 12 factors for coping from this individual crisis psychology. Some examples.
Yeah. I did not choose the factors. The 12 factors were ones that Marie and other therapists had seen were important for resolving personal crises. And they're things that you know in a personal crisis. The first thing you got to do is acknowledge that you're in a crisis, otherwise you get nowhere. And the next thing you have to do is to acknowledge that you have some responsibility for dealing with a crisis. If you just blame it on other people, if you say that the problems of the United States are the fault of China and Canada and Mexico and there's nothing that we poor Americans can do, you get nowhere towards resolving the crisis. So Marie and other psychologists had already identified those factors. In the book, then, I looked at parallels for national crises.
And some of the way those parallels play out are, for instance, ego strength, national identity. Right?
That's right, yeah. There's an example. In some cases, the mapping is close. We as individuals get help from other people. Nations don't get help from other people. Nations do or don't get help from other nations. So, for example, after World War II, Germany and so many European countries got help from the Marshall Plan, whereas in 1939, when Finland was attacked by the Soviet Union, Finland got help from none of its traditional allies. There's a close parallel. A more distant parallel is the one that you mentioned, namely individuals have something that psychologists call ego strength. A person is more likely to get through a crisis if you have a sense of yourself, self-confidence, if your image of yourself doesn't depend upon other people. Well, countries, of course, don't have ego strength, but countries have something that the idea of ego strength suggests, and that is national identity. Some countries have a strong national identity, like the United States and Germany and Finland, whereas Indonesia, a country that I've been working in since 1979, has a weaker national identity for the obvious reason that Indonesia became independent only in 1949, whereas we've had more than 2 centuries to develop a national identity.
Yeah, and I would imagine that when you develop your national identity in emerging globalization, it's a lot different than developing that identity back when countries were more isolated.
That's true, and different countries get national identities in different ways. Some countries have a national identity that depends upon military successes. Well, Italy today does not have recent military successes. Italy's national identity instead depends upon memories of the Roman Empire, and today it depends upon Italian style and Italian art and Italian food. The Finnish national identity depends heavily on the very distinctive Finnish language and Finland's success in the Winter War. So different countries get their national identities in different ways.
We're going to end up spending a fair amount of time on the U.S. and the world, but I would love you to pick Chile. Yeah. Let's deal with Chile. What was the crisis? How did the coping mechanisms work, and what can we learn from it?
Sure. Chile is the South American country, the Latin American country that is the most democratic country in Latin America. Chile has had a long history, almost uninterrupted history until 1973, of democracy. And Chileans, when I went to live in Chile in 1967, my Chilean friends began by telling the visiting American, we are not like those other Latin American countries that have military dictatorships. We know how to govern ourselves. That's what they said in 1967, but Chile in 1967 was falling into political polarization between the left and center and right that couldn't compromise and reach agreement on anything. Hint, hint, does that remind you of any country today? And in 1967, my Chilean friends didn't see what was coming, namely the end of democracy, but it came 6 years later in 1973 when a military coup took over Chile, ran Chile for 17 years, and smashed world records for sadism and torture. So when you ask what are, say, the outcome predictors that show for Chile, in Chile there was selective change. Well, all of you know in personal crises, you don't change all of yourself. You change selectively. You change what needs to be changed. In Chile, the military government replaced democracy with a dictatorship, and it changed the economy from government interference to free market, but Chile retained its borders and retained its Catholic identity. So Chile illustrates selective change. Chile also illustrates strong national identity, because when the military government fell in 1990, you would think that that's an opportunity for there to be revenge against those who had killed so many Chileans. But instead, the first socialist president of Chile in 1990, in his inaugural address, said, what we are going to build is a Chile for all Chileans. And that was a euphemism to mean we're not going to take revenge. This is a country where the tortured can live together with the torturers. And that requires strong national identity for all Chileans, whether they tortured or were tortured, to live together.
And how has it gone?
How has it gone? It's gone remarkably well. Some of the perpetrators of tortures have been sent to prison, but there's not been mass revenge. There's not been any killing. And Chile today is again the richest or second richest country in Latin America, and it's had an uninterrupted history of democracy since 1990. So I would consider this a real success story of selective change.
Yeah. And one of the things you point out that I'd never considered was that Chile is, in a way, the California of South America. Why?
I went to Chile because it's the California of Latin America. That is, California is the Mediterranean zone of the United States, a Mediterranean climate, a dry climate with wet winters and hot, dry summers. Chile is the Mediterranean climate of South America, just as the Mediterranean in South Africa and Southwest Australia are the other Mediterranean climates around the world. Chile and California are climatic equivalents, but they're also leaders in their hemispheres. And that's why the University of California had an exchange program with Chile until it ended with the fall of the government and with the breakdown of political compromise.
Sure. And another, Chile is an example of the crisis from within. Finland is an example of a crisis from without.
Right. In Chile, the crisis was an explosion within the country. In Finland, the crisis was that on the night of November 30, 1939, Finland, with a population then of 3,900,000, was attacked by the Soviet Union with a population of 170 million that placed territorial demands on Finland. The Soviet Union placed demands on Baltic republics as well. Nobody thought that a small country like Finland would be so crazy as to resist the Soviet Union. But Finland did, and it managed to fight the Soviet Union to a standstill, preserving its independence, unlike Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. But 100,000 Finns got killed in the process, and lots of others got traumatized, and the Finns made selective change. Out of all this, Finland remained a liberal democracy, but it completely changed its foreign policy towards the Soviet Union because the Finns realized nobody helped us then, nobody will help us in the future. We have to deal with the Soviet Union by ourselves.
Right, and if it means independence with some subjugation, we'll take that.
That's right. As an example of the curtailment of Finnish independence, the Finns called off a presidential election because the competing candidate displeased the Soviet Union. In the United States, the idea that the U.S. would call off the election of 2020 because, say, the Democratic candidate was unpleasing to China, unthinkable. No democracy would ever do that. But the United States is not at risk the way Finland was at risk.
Right.
So Finland is a democracy that learned just how far it had to compromise with democracy in order to preserve its independence and avoid 100,000 Finns getting killed again.
So I want to just touch on a couple more of the coping mechanisms. So we've talked about selective change. You don't give up your identity, but there are certain things which you want to retain, but you're willing to change some things. The first two, as you said, admit you got a crisis, take responsibility, don't blame others. What are a couple of others that work very well in this comparison between individuals and countries?
Another that works well, both for individuals and countries, and this is something that all of you know, I'm sure, well from your personal experience. A crisis early in life, when you've not previously had a crisis. Why is it that crises are so upsetting for teenagers and for young people? It's because it's their first big crisis in life, and they don't have a track record of knowing we can get through a crisis. Whereas if you have a crisis later in life, so my most severe professional crisis was at age 21 when I had not faced a big personal crisis. I've had professional crises since then, but after that I knew that I had gotten through this crisis when I was 21. That gave me confidence that I'd get through a later one. And for countries as well, a country that has been through a crisis looks back to that crisis for strength. For example, Britain looks back to the Battle of Britain when Britain alone fought off Hitler and the Luftwaffe. The British feel since we did that, since we preserved our independence against Hitler, we can do anything. And again, Finland today, when Finland last year celebrated the 100th anniversary of its independence, the focus of Finland's Independence Day was not Finnish independence in 1918. The focus was the Winter War when Finland fought Russia to a standstill, because Finns today realize since we preserved our independence against the Soviet Union, we can do anything now.
Very good. Let's talk about the U.S. I'm reading a quote here. A sense of crisis is widespread in the U.S. today, and 4 major problems are not moving towards solution, but are getting worse. And first of all, does that mean we're admitting we're in a crisis, that first step, or not? And second, what are those problems?
Some Americans would regard us as in a crisis, others would regard us as perhaps spiraling towards a crisis. Many Americans would deny that we're in a crisis. So there's not yet a national agreement that we're in a crisis, whereas on the night of November 30, 1939, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland, every Finn knew that there was a national crisis. So Americans are still debating whether we're in a national crisis, and Americans also have not accepted responsibility that they got to change something. When Japan in 1853 had its couple of centuries of isolation ended by force by the arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet, every Japanese knew that there was a crisis, and that it was Japan's responsibility to dig its way out of the crisis. Whereas today, as I mentioned, there are many Americans who don't regard the United States as having to change anything. Instead, they say, our crisis is not of our own making. It's what China and Mexico are doing to us. But if you blame America's problems today on China and Mexico, of course we won't make any progress towards solving them, because we can't change China and Mexico.
And what are the 4 problems you think that constitute this crisis?
Jared Diamond will now reveal to you something that none of you ever knew, which is what are the big problems facing the United States today? Well, this is subject to debate. All of you will come up with your own list of 4. For me, the problem that most concerns me about the United States is the breakdown of political compromise, because that's the thing that could end democracy in the United States, just as democracy ended in Chile, not by a military coup, but by what we're doing to ourselves. And the other big problems that I see in the United States are restrictions on voting, the prevention of would-be voters from registering to vote, because that means that we're a democracy on paper but not in reality, the decline of socioeconomic equality and mobility, and finally the decline of government investment in public goods such as education. Let me give you an example from yesterday, because this was just so stunning to me. Yesterday I took a taxi ride. The taxi driver had an interesting pronunciation. I asked, where are you from? He's from Uzbekistan, the Central Asian country of Uzbekistan. He's been in the United States for 12 years. Are you married? Yes, I have an Uzbek wife. Have you got children? My wife and my children, they're back in Uzbekistan. Why are your children back in Uzbekistan? They're back in Uzbekistan because public education in Uzbekistan is better than that in the United States, particularly math and language education in Uzbekistan, of all unlikely countries, are better than in the United States. And that's because of the precipitous decline of public education in the United States in the last 50 years, because our governments will not spend the money for public education.
Wow.
That was stunning.
Even Borat would be surprised at that, I swear. So one thing that I notice is equality and mobility might not be, although they're influenced by political, but 3 of them are challenges to democracy. That we have democracy in name, but not necessarily thriving in substance.
Sure, the lack of equality and mobility in the United States means essentially that Americans are throwing away 90% of Americans. Our country is population of 330 million, but if 90% of those 330 million don't have access to a first-class education, we are competing with countries like South Korea, Finland, and Germany, and Japan, which invest in every one of their citizens. So the United States, with 330 million people, may have 40, 50 million well-trained people, but we're competing with Japan, population of 127 million, and the Japanese government. Not only does the Japanese government invest in the education of every Japanese, in the United States, poorer school districts where people are poor, get a lower teacher-to-student ratio, whereas in Japan, poor school districts get more teachers per student. That's to say, the policy of the Japanese government is to make an effort to pull up school districts where the students aren't getting a good education, whereas in the United States it's the reverse. Those who are in bad shape, let them get into worse shape.
And one of the coping factors you say the U.S. is really messing up now is that of using other countries as models. You were kind of referring to that. Now, as we know, in individual cases, you're having trouble in your marriage, you look for models of people who seem to be doing well. What are they doing? I have been on this horse for 20 years, the fact that we don't learn from it. Is it a particularly American thing? Is it because of our geographical isolation? Is it because of that belief in exceptionalism? What is it?
Let me join you on the horse that you've been on for 20 years. Every country is, the United States is exceptional. Every country is exceptional. But the United States is wrapped up in what we call American exceptionalism, the belief that we are so exceptional that we cannot learn from any other country. Most countries recognize that they can learn from other countries. Japan did, In the United States, we think we're so exceptional that we can't learn from other democracies like Canada and Western Europe and Japan and Australia. But the United States suffers from the same problems as do other democracies. We have problems with health care, and we have problems with registering voters, and we have problems with equality, and we have problems with education and prisons. Canada and Western European countries and Japan and so on solve many of these problems in more satisfactory ways. We Americans are dissatisfied with how we deal with problems of prisons and education, but we refuse to look to our neighbors, Canada and Western Europe and Australia, because we think we are so exceptional that we have nothing to learn from them, which is nonsense, utter nonsense.
Oh, and so damaging. I mean, one example that I've, from this horse that I've been talking about is in Germany, very advanced country, export leader. If you have 2,000 employees, half the board is elected from the workers. In America, I can't imagine a union even asking for that.
In Germany, when you say that half the board is elected from the workers, that illustrates why Germany has relatively few strikes and relatively high productivity compared to the U.S. In Germany, after World War II, the businesses and the workers, in effect, made a pact where the unions agreed not to strike or rarely to strike, and in return, companies passed on a share of their increasing profits to the workers, whereas in the United States, as you know, the gap between the income of the CEO and of the average worker is growing and growing.
Yep. So finally, in your last chapter, What Lies Ahead for the World, you finally, you're comparing individual to nation. We take on nations and the U.S. finally, but then the world. You focus on, again, 4 problems, which, if trends continue, you believe, will undermine living standards within the next several decades. And I saw a headline in a newspaper article recently that said, you said, we have a 49% chance
of not. I've calculated this very accurately. The chances are 49% that we will not have a happy ending, and 51%.
By 2050.
By 2050. Yeah, well, just think of it. The reality is that people sometimes ask, what will the world be like 1,000 years from now? Who cares what it'll be like 1,000 years from now? What counts is what it's going to be like 30 years from now, because as you all know, the world is on a non-sustainable course. We're exploiting fisheries and forests and topsoil and water unsustainably at a rate such that within roughly 30 years, we're going to run out of these essential resources unless we figure out how to manage them in a sustainable way. So that's why I say that it's all going to get settled within the next 30 years, whether we have a bright future thereafter. And as for, we've been talking about heavy stuff, the United States. It's nice now to switch on to a bagatelle, the problems of the whole world. But here again, I will reveal to you, because none of you know what the problems of the whole world are. Jared Diamond will now reveal to you the serious problems of the world, and they are, to your great surprise, the nuclear risk of nuclear war, India, Pakistan, United States, North Korea, or terrorists, problem number 1. Problem number 2, you'll be astonished that climate change is a serious problem. Problem number 3, you'll be utterly astounded that non-sustainable use of resources is a significant problem. And then it will just bug your belief to hear about problem number 4, which is inequality around the world that leads to the spread of diseases from countries with poor public health systems to countries with better public health systems, and also leads to unstoppable immigration and support for terrorism.
Right.
Isn't that a surprise to you?
I wanted to mention that I got 2 different emails within the last week from various environmental organizations saying, we want you to demand that the media begin to refer to the climate crisis, not climate change, not global warming, but climate crisis. How does that fit into all of this?
The climate crisis, if we had 2,000 years to deal with it, it would not be a climate crisis. It would be a creeping problem. But we do have a climate crisis because within a few decades, it's possible that the rise in temperature and in local drought around the world is going to be beyond our capacity to deal with, is going to become irreversible. So yes, it's not a November 30, 1939 Finland crisis where it blows up overnight, but instead, it's a crisis that is increasing at a rate such that those of you here who are under the age of 60, you're going to see the outcome. This is a crisis that will either end happily or unhappily in your lifetimes.
You said that if you had stopped writing your chapter on the world without the last 6 pages, it would have been much more pessimistic. Tell about that, both that point in the process.
Let me tease you here. The next to last chapter in my book, Authors Are Shameless, is on the problems of the world. And the initial draft of my chapter on the problems of the world ended 6 pages before where it ends now. It ended pessimistically. It seemed to me that the world did not have a track record of solving difficult problems, whereas we in our personal lives, you gain strength from knowing that you solved difficult problems before. But then I realized, and I was able to add the last 6 pages of that chapter, optimistic pages, that the world, in fact, in my lifetime, in the last several decades, has managed to get together to solve really difficult problems, such as eliminating the worst disease of history, smallpox, that required eliminating smallpox in every country of the world. And some of those countries, the last smallpox case was in Somalia. There's no country more difficult than Somalia to get the last case of smallpox, but we did it. Other things that the world managed to get together to solve were getting chlorofluorocarbons out of the atmosphere because they were destroying the ozone layer. Every country had to agree to that. The world managed to get every country on the seacoast to agree to delineating coastal zones, and there were so many arguments about that. Recently, the world has reached a framework for mining mineral nodules from the seabed. Again, every country had to agree, and landlocked countries like Bolivia and Laos didn't want to agree because they don't have ships that can go mine minerals on the seafloor, but a negotiation was reached whereby landlocked countries like Bolivia and Laos get 15% of the proceeds earned by countries that do have a seacoast and do have ships. So the world, in fact, has solved all these really difficult problems. Since we can do that, I think we can solve climate change and the nuclear risk, and that's why I see the chances that we will have a happy outcome as 51% rather than 49%.
Right. Now, I'm going to noodle with that and maybe drop you to 50-50, because it seems to me that, like the ozone hole, the global culture, it seemed to me, was very different then. At this point where we face global problems that demand global collaboration in a way that we never have before, this nationalism, this belligerent nationalism is on the rise. What explains the rise, and how are we going to deal with that?
What explains the rise of nationalism, which one sees particularly at a distance? We Americans can see it in Western Europe, countries like Hungary and Poland. But the fact is that there's also a rise of nationalism in some segments of the United States. What's the reason for it? There are multiple things that go into it. I think one of the reasons is the concern about immigration, which is a bigger problem than it is generally acknowledged to be. The cruel reality is that of the world's population of 7.5 billion people, 1 billion of us are living at first world living standards, and 6.5 billion of us are living at developing world living standards, which means on the average, incomes standards of living 30 times poorer. The reality is those 6.5 billion people out there know perfectly well that they would have a happier life and they would enjoy more personal freedom and they would be in less personal danger if they were in the few countries with a high standard of living. But the reality is that you can't pile 6.5 billion people into Western Europe and Japan and Australia and the United States. So it's a really difficult problem, and I think a spill-off of that is the growth of nationalism, particularly in Western Europe, where the European Union, for idealistic reasons connected with what happened when they didn't let refugees in after World War II, the European Union has been reluctant to put numbers on what they really can do for immigration.
So you're saying, and where does that fit into the coping mechanisms, that particular thing of saying this problem we're in denial about, and we're not willing to deal with it because, as you said, ideologically, historic. What coping mechanism will correct that?
The coping mechanism, or lack thereof, that illustrates seems to me to be honest self-appraisal. Again, all of you who've been through any life problem, breakdown of a marriage, death of a loved one, a career setback, you know that in order to solve a problem, you got to be honest with yourself. You have to recognize what of yourself is working okay and what of yourself needs changing. If you deny reality, in Britain today, for example, the drive behind Brexit involves massive denial of reality. If you deny reality, you're not going to make progress towards solving a problem. And Brexit is an interesting example because some segments in those portions of the United Kingdom with the fewest immigrants are the ones who are most upset about immigration, but the numbers are that there are more British people, more British citizens living on the European continent than any other European country has citizens living in another European country. And so if the British, despite there being more British abroad than there are Poles in Britain, if the British nevertheless want Brexit, when there are so many British people in Spain and Ireland and the United States, before Brexit, what the British should be asking for is not Brexit, but Spexit with Spain and Irexit with Ireland and you Sexit with the United States.
Now, so that I'm not leaving you having said we've got to keep those migrants from migrating, damn it, what would you suggest for that the first world countries that would actually deal with this in a realistic way?
Realistically, the only long-term solution to the issue of immigration is to reduce these big differences in standards of living around the world. And there are cheap ways to do that rich countries are not pursuing. For example, one of the big things holding back the economies of poor countries is their public health problems, their short lifespans, their high child mortality rates, resulting in large family rates. If in a country where so you take a country where the lifespan is not 85 as in Japan, or 81 as in the United States, but it's 45. So you train an engineer, and the engineer is out to practice engineering at age 30, and then on the average, he or she is dead at age 45. So you get 15 years of productivity out of the engineer, whereas in the United States, you get 40, 50 years of productivity out of the engineer. The world's biggest killers, the reasons for those short lifespans, the number one killers around the world are AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. The estimates are that it would take something like $30 billion, maybe $30 billion a year, to solve these biggest causes of short lifespans and hence poor economies in the developing world. Well, the United States has lots of things to do with large multiples of 30 billion, but the US government is not putting 30 billion into malaria control. The Gates Foundation is, but the Gates Foundation alone is not enough. So the simplest thing that the United States could do for our own self-interest is not to be nice to those poor people out there. No. Yes, it is nice to the poor people out there, but it's selfishness on the part of the United States to cure one of the biggest threats to the stability of the world and of the United States, namely invest in public health for poor companies so that they have increased lifespans, be richer, and that will reduce the pressure for immigration and will reduce the spread of disease. I just came back from Italy, and in Italy, chikungunya fever from Uganda is now spreading to Italy because of climate change and globalization.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I mean, it seems so, the Marshall Plan was so successful, I hold that over here. On the other hand, Americans have this wildly unrealistic idea of what we spend on foreign aid.
Right, the Marshall Plan can be thought of as charity to other countries. The United States adopted the Marshall Plan after World War II, not because we wanted to be nice and charitable. It was selfish policy on the part of the United States to strengthen Western European and other democracies for their good, but also for our own good.
Yeah. We're going to go to questions from the audience next. The last question I want to ask in this section here is about California. Okay? On many issues, it seems to me we're years ahead of the rest of the country, and I would put that not just in the good, but we were ahead in the bad. In 1994, we voted for 287, Prop 287, which was anti-immigration, you know, harsher than most things that's going on nowadays. And we faced our energy crisis, 2000, 2001, but somehow we've gotten to where we are now. On the one hand, we seem to be doing very well with climate and so on, and yet, based on when you consider cost of living, we lead the country in poverty. Talk a little bit about California in the, in the sense of, in the context of this book.
Yes, I'll be glad to talk about California, particularly because I was born and brought up in Boston, and I moved to California only at age 28, so Los Angeles is still a foreign land for me. Nevertheless, while you can point out negative things about California, you can point out negative things about anybody. My wife can point out negative things about me and vice versa. Nevertheless, my wife and I are both wonderful people. And as far as California is concerned, yes, you can point out some negative things about California, but I still like California, and I think California is a great state, and if California were independent, it would be the 6th richest country in the world. There are some things that haven't gone well in California, but the fact is that California has the best system of university public education in the country, and California is perhaps the most progressive state as far as environmental policy is concerned. So while you can bash one or two things about California, I'm voting with my feet and I'm staying here.
Very good. Ted, questions from the audience?
If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. Just a quick reminder, questions around here start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question. And tonight, only Terrence McNally gets to ask the follow-up questions.
So, sorry if you ever addressed this, but I wanted to know, what is your opinion on the great man theory of history?
Okay, I'm going to rephrase it, and I didn't hear that well, but I think you said, would he comment on the great man theory of history?
Correct.
Yeah.
Great.
I would love to comment on the great man theory of history, which is one of the most interesting and fundamental debates about history. The question is, do leaders really make a difference, or are leaders reflections of their times and their circumstances? This is a running debate among historians. The opposite views are, on the one hand, the great man theory of history, associated with Thomas Carlyle around 1820, who argued that history is the deeds of great men. This was 1820, not great women, but great men. But an opposite view, which is preferred by historians, most historians today, is that leaders, seemingly independently acting leaders, Churchill and Roosevelt, really were strongly restricted in what they could do by their times, so that leaders do not have a dominant force in world history. This is a question which my shamelessly advertised book discusses briefly in the last chapter without finally resolving it. It's something that, because I develop my books by teaching the material to my UCLA undergraduates for 4 or 5 years before I write a book, and I can see from the faces of my UCLA undergraduates whether they like the material and whether they understand it. And it's better for me to get feedback from friendly people before a book is published than from enemies after a book is published. Next winter, I'll be teaching at UCLA to my undergraduates a course in the effect of leadership among nations and leadership in the business world, and also leadership in the athletic world, UCLA within the last year has fired its basketball coach and its football coach, but statistical analyses show that teams that fire their coaches don't do better in the next several years. So casting some doubt on the role of leaders in the sports world.
Very good.
You made this comparison that we have to acknowledge the truth before we can solve problems. So can you comment on our current political climate in which we listen to lies every single day, and how we overcome that as a people to get back to truth-telling so that we can solve problems?
Like in the United States, for example.
That's what I was talking about.
Yeah. So how do we solve the problems of the United States? There's a really simple starting point, and that is to vote. All right. So seriously, in the United States, there are restrictions on voting. Many Americans are not able to register to vote. But the shocking fact is that the voter turnout of Americans who do get registered to vote is the worst of any major democracy. In Italy, in every parliamentary election and every plebiscite since World War II, the percentage of Italians voting has been between 85 and 93%. The United States has never come close to that. The highest voter turnout in modern American history was 61% for the presidential election of 2008. And to rub it into all of us Los Angelinos, in the most recent election for mayor of Los Angeles, which after all is one of the most important civic positions in the United States, the voter turnout was 20%, and I just came from Dallas where the voter turnout for mayor of Dallas was 7%. So how are we going to solve our problems? A starting point is to vote, because if we can't vote, we deserve the bad government we're getting.
Her question wasn't exactly that. Her question was, you say that acknowledging the truth of the situation is an essential first step, and we now in this country have lies running rampant every day. How do we reverse that? How do we cope with that?
How do we cope with that? Again, part of the way to cope is voting, because there are people who perceive correctly what the problems are. The other part is for those people who have some knowledge in the area to explain clearly to the general public, and that's something that universities can do. It's an area where universities around the United States have fallen down, because in academia there's a prejudice against academics who explain things in terms that the public can understand. God help you if you are an assistant professor at UCLA and write a book for the public. You'll never get tenure. You'd better not write a book for the public until you've gotten tenure. But there's a widespread scorn in academia for writing things in understandable terms rather than in academic jargon. And there's a jealousy and resistance to writing things in ways that the whole country can understand. So another contribution to overcoming blindness, overcoming denial of problems, is for those people who understand, academics who understand them, to write about them, and for other academics not to block their careers.
It's great to be here with you. Thank you. In your list of the 4 things that are problematic, I always look at what are the cures, and it's been suggested that a wealth tax might make equality happen. It's been suggested that a plant-based diet might help climate change. What are some other things that can maybe give us hope that we could focus on in our own lives that are real solutions?
You get that? She said she suggested some things that are solutions to some of the 4 problems you mentioned, such as possibly a wealth tax to deal with inequality, a plant-based diet to deal with climate and so on. What are some other solutions that I think you were saying that we could even deal with on an individual basis that you think could reckon with those problems?
Sure. The solutions can be characterized as either top-down or bottom-up solutions. There are things that only the government can do. Only the government could decide to ban lead in gasoline throughout the United States. An individual, at most, could choose to use lead-free gasoline, but could not change the whole country. But there are things that individuals can do. What can individuals do? You can go to PTA meetings of your schools. You can vote for school taxes. You can vote for carbon taxes. You can vote against bad things, so voting is part of it. You can join your neighborhood councils. For example, in the area of LA where I live, there is a neighborhood council, and recently there was a big argument about parking on the streets. Turned out that a few people in the neighborhood were pushing their own selfish interests, and it took a mobilization on the part of the neighborhood to get a sensible parking policy for the neighborhood. So in short, there are things that only government can do, and you can influence that by voting and by telling 10 of your friends to vote, but there are also things that you can do to set a good example, such as walking, using bicycles, buying cars with very good mileage per gallon. So you can do things in your own life, but you can also vote for the government to do things at a large scale.
What would some of the government's large-scale solutions or possible solutions to some of these problems of global climate change, political divisiveness, what might you suggest there?
Sure. Large-scale problems for the world.
Large-scale government solutions.
Large-scale solutions to the world problem. Take climate change. All of you know perfectly well what is the solution to climate change. Climate change is caused today overwhelmingly by the burning of fossil fuels. In order to solve the problem of climate change, we need to burn less fossil fuels, and that consists of two steps. One, reducing our overall consumption of energy. The United States' consumption of energy per person per year is high. It's about double that of Western Europe, and it's partly because we drive these gas-guzzling cars. It's partly because in Europe, the government imposes taxes on buying cars that increases with the size of the car, whereas in the United States, Humvees, I believe, got less tax rather than more tax. So that's then one thing. Reducing energy consumption. The other part of it is getting more of our energy from sustainable sources and not from fossil fuels. That's to say, getting more of our energy from wind, solar, hydroelectric, and tidal. And yes, all of these types of energy production have their problems. Windmills, for example, kill birds and bats, and yes, they do kill birds and bats, but climate change kills far more birds and bats. And if you're really concerned about the 42,000 birds per year that get killed by windmills around the United States, reflect that the average outdoor cat kills 300 birds per year, so those 42,000 birds per year killed by windmills are the work of about 166 cats. Get 166 cats out of the neighborhood and you can double the number of windmills.
And you shied away from that data analysis. I don't.
22 years after Guns, Germs, and Steel, which ideas do you think have held up well, and what would you update now?
I couldn't understand you.
22 years after Guns, Germs, and Steel, which ideas do you think have held up well, and what would you update now?
Oh, I got it. 22 years after Guns, Germs, and Steel, which ideas have held up and which merit re-examination?
All right, you're going to hear the answer from a shameless author. 22 years after I published Guns, Germs, and Steel, which of the basic ideas have held up? And the answer is all of them have held up, because basically it was the right answer. The reason for the difference, Guns, Germs, and Steel, my book, is about the different outcomes of history over large areas for a long time. Why is it that here today we are talking in the English language and we're not talking in Chumash or Algonquin? History played out differently for Native Americans from how it played out for Europeans. And the reason I found in Guns, Germs, and Steel has nothing to do with Europeans and Native Americans and Africans as people. It has everything to do with the environmental opportunities, particularly the plants and animal species available for domestication in different parts of the world. That doesn't mean that there's nothing that we've learned nothing since Guns, Germs, and Steel in 1998. Yes, we have learned things that have enriched the picture. For example, we have learned that India was a minor but significant independent center of domestication, and that wasn't clear in 1998. And we've learned that some of the major species like goats and pigs were domesticated independently in different parts of Eurasia, and the evidence for that was not so good in 1998. But the basic argument that the differences in history for different peoples over long term are due not to differences in people, and particularly their IQs, but instead due to differences in the environment. That has not changed in the last 22 years, and it's right. Shameless.
Shameless.
Oh, Stan. Hi, thank you for the talk so far. I wanted to ask, so in the case of personal crisis, you've mentioned the importance of people not blaming others, taking a certain degree of personal responsibility. And I'm thinking in some cases of people who are relatively powerless. We might frame this as blaming the victim. And in some sense, I wonder what the analogy carries over to relatively powerless countries. To what degree can they take responsibility and not blame others when maybe they are in fact being dominated by other countries?
Good question, and it's the key question. I'm sure it's something that has bothered every one of us here. The fact is that some of the bad stuff that happens to us is caused by other people. The question is, how are you going to react to it? If when people are doing bad things to you say, oh, poor me, I'm a victim, self-pity, self-pity, you're going to get nowhere towards dealing with it. Instead, if there are bad people there, the problem is for you, what are you going to do about those bad people? It's still ultimately your responsibility to deal with them. And there are different ways of dealing with people who are causing you trouble. But the important thing is not to get overwhelmed with self-pity, but to figure out what you are going to do given those people out there.
And Terrence, you want to take the last question for the evening?
Sure. One thing that when I asked you at the start about the sort of the methodology of the book, narrative, comparative, and so on. Narrative was the first thing, and all your books that I've read are really strong on narrative. You tell stories to make your points. And I'm going to ask you about narrative. This is a quote that I saw soon after the 2016 election by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. What is the compelling narrative that can drive Americans to yearn for a future richer than the past some of them want to go back to, or fuel their emotions into yearning rather than fear?
Great question. In the past 2 weeks, today is the last stop for me in a 10-city book publicity tour. And I began in Boston, where my son, one of our two sons, our son Max lives. I had a free day in Boston. I asked, what would you like to do with Daddy on your free day? Max said that he wanted to see Concord and Lexington battlefields. Well, I've grown up in Boston. I've seen Concord and Lexington. I didn't think that it would do anything to me. I went to Concord and Lexington. I must say it was overwhelming. I had difficulty just keeping my cool seeing the battle. It is so moving to see those battlefields. This is where American independence began. It's where some Americans got killed in order to fight their liberty, to fight for their liberty. Concord and Lexington, they're really moving. But what is our leader, what's our president doing today? Is he going around and talking about the things of American history that bring us together and about which we can be proud? No. What I would see as the way that's going to get us out of our current problems will be stress, and that means our leaders stressing the things of which Americans can be proud and that bring us together, not the various identity issues that divide us. But if we had a president who on April 18th would go to Concord battlefield and talk about what Concord meant, or my third stop was Rochester, New York, the Erie Canal. If we had a president who would go to the Erie Canal on the anniversary of its opening and talk about the Erie Canal and its role in opening the center of the United States to the coast. If we had a president who would go to Ellis Island and talk about the significance of Ellis Island. If we had a leader who would stress the things that unify us Americans and of which we can be proud, rather than blaming other countries for things that are really our responsibility. If we stress the positive and the unifying, That seems to me the necessary thing and the only thing that's going to get us out of our present mess.
Thank you.